He's on the job as the new U.S. ambassador to Japan, front and center in the U.S. confrontation with China after it extended military control into what the U.S. says is international airspace.
With their announcement of an East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone, undermine security and constitute an attempt to change the status quo in the East China Sea.
China declared it now controls a vast portion of the airspace over the East China Sea and remote islands that both China and Japan claim, ground zero in this high-stakes tension. China demanding for the first time that aircraft flying through the zone file flight plans and maintain two-way radio contact.
This only serves to increase tensions in the region.
Vice President Joe Biden will visit China, Japan, and South Korea next week on a planned trip. A senior administration official says the vice president will, quote, seek clarity regarding the Chinese intentions. There are worries China, if not bracing for confrontation, is still dangerously raising tension.
I don't think we're headed for conflict in the near term, but it is a sort of setting of preconditions that could eventually lead to some sort of military miscalculation or accident among the sides and then create a real crisis.
China has vowed to take emergency measures to respond to aircraft that do not cooperate with its new rules. The U.S. military quickly challenged all of that, flying two B-52 unarmed bombers through the zone. A U.S. official tells CNN the flight was, in part, aimed at showing that the U.S. military can strike targets in the region. The Pentagon did not tell China in advance of the flight, but kept watch to see if China scrambled jets. It did not. The Chinese also kept watch.
It's indeed the right of every country to defend its airspace and also to make sure that its territorial integrity, its sovereignty are safeguarded. This is a normal arrangement.
Now, the U.S. military has reason to worry about an incident escalating. Back in 2001, a U.S. Navy aircraft collided with a Chinese jet, and that Navy plane then crash landed into China. The 24-man crew on board the Navy plane was held by the Chinese for 11 days before they were released. So, Jim, good reason, bad feelings in history, good reason to potentially worry about this.
Tense moments then, tense moments now. Thanks very much to Barbara Starr. We're going to bring in now the former U.S. ambassador to China, Jon Huntsman, also CNN military analyst Spider March, former Major General, also former intel officer in Asia. I'm going to ask you first, Ambassador Huntsman, if I can, how quickly could this lead to miscalculation? You've got a lot of military assets close together there. Chance for misinterpretation of a move could lead to something bigger.
Well, Jim, this is a very difficult, tense, and complicated situation. And that's the biggest challenge of all. Not that there is a war of words, but you have several countries in the region, all of whom are on surveillance missions, either on the high seas or in the air. And the possibility of a miscalculation is very real. And the problem is you escalate the tension, and there's no real plan to de-escalate. And we saw that before, as was pointed out in April of 2001 with the downing of the EP-3 spy plane. It was very difficult to de-escalate, and we just don't have the kinds of plans that would allow us to de-escalate. And with Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, Russia, the United States, all sort of snooping around in the area, it becomes a very crowded flight zone and maritime zone, and therefore the possibility for miscalculation is very real.
General Marks, did the U.S. do the right thing flying those B-52s over the airspace?
They absolutely did. If the United States had not challenged this unilateral declaration of a change of the ADIZ, a new standard would have been set. The Chinese would have declared a form of success. The United States had to challenge it, and I think they challenged it very, very well. The B-52, albeit a very capable aircraft, was not armed. It's not going to penetrate into Chinese beyond that ADIZ, not going to penetrate into Chinese mainland. But I think it's very, very important. We have always had a very large military presence in the region. So the escalation, certainly the possibility of an escalation is always present. But we've had this dance, and we've handled it very well, and Ambassador, you've been a part of that very intimately. We've been able to do this dance pretty effectively. This was an act on the part of the Chinese clearly to be provocative. What does the U.S. pivot to Asia mean? I would argue we've never unpivoted, if that's an appropriate term, from Asia.
That's right.
It's always been the decade of China. It's always had a very clear focus for the United States to be there, to assert ourselves, and to really galvanize and really put some markers down.
So what was China trying to accomplish here? You've been through tough moments with the Chinese during your term.
Well, they're trying to delegitimize Japan's claim to the Senkaku or the Diaoyu Islands. Same thing they're trying to do with Scarborough Reef with the Philippines. The same thing they're trying to do in the South China Sea with Vietnam and several other claimants. And they're also trying to drive a wedge, quite frankly, Jim, between the U.S. and Japan with respect to their security alliance. And therefore, we have to be particularly vigilant in terms of close consultation with Japan. I noticed the sound bites coming out of Tokyo were very carefully coordinated with Washington, and the general's absolutely right. That rapid response to the air defense identification zone established by China through a freedom of navigation maneuver was absolutely the right thing to do. If we had allowed any blue sky to prevail there, it could have been real trouble in terms of the Chinese further claiming that as theirs and scaring the neighborhood.
Well, Defense Secretary Hagel made a point of reminding people that the U.S. Defense Treaty, Mutual Defense Treaty with Japan, covers these islands. In effect, if there was a confrontation, the U.S. would be obligated to take part. That's a big deal.
Well, Jimmy, when you look at what the Chinese did, they literally cut a piece out of the Japanese ADIZ, the acknowledged and recognized ADIZ. So that clearly was very, very confrontational on their part. They knew exactly what they were doing. And then the backdrop of all of this is we're in an austere budget period. We're talking about sequester. The United States military is trying to figure out what it's going to look like, specifically in that part of the world. What are the Marines going to do in Okinawa? What's the future of Guam? What's our presence in Japan? How is that relationship going? So clearly this made perfect sense for the Chinese to focus in the island.
And then the backdrop in the Asia-Pacific region is also a very interesting one because you're seeing the rise of new leaders in Northeast Asia. You have Xi Jinping in China, who's only been in office now a year, just finishing his formal transition into power. In Japan, you have Shinzo Abe. While it's his second tour as prime minister, he's pretty much brand new. You've got a new president in South Korea, the daughter of Park Chung-hee. You've got a new leader in North Korea. So the whole region, sensitive as it is because of the geographic and sovereignty disputes, sensitive because of history and how it's played out in recent years, is going to be a very interesting place to keep your eye on in the months and years ahead. And the United States is going to have to establish its presence in the region, to be forthright in terms of its support for our alliances, to speak clearly, and to make sure we're consistent in all that we do.
Vice President Biden, either good timing or bad, it turns out he's going to be in China next week. I remember on a previous visit when there had been some close flybys, he actually brought photographs from U.S. planes showing how close Chinese fighters got within 10 feet of the wing, just to show the danger of this, snowballing into something worse. What do you think his message is going to be when he visits the Chinese next week?
It's going to be hopefully a voice of calm, but also one of resolute focus in terms of what the United States' interest is in that region. Clearly, as the ambassador laid out, there are fissures and there are opportunities. We should view this as an opportunity for the United States to make sure it's crystal clear. We are here to stay. We always have been. We're not going anywhere.
Ambassador Huntsman, last word. What would you say if you were in that room?
Well, it's always going to be an attempt to shore up and talk about those areas we have in common, our mutual interests, and also at the same time talking about our interests in the region that might diverge and how we're going to stand tall in protecting those, and how our relationship with our allies in the region will be very, very important. In light of what's happened most recently, that kind of discussion is going to be extremely important because they will listen for the clarity of the words that are spoken. And this is not a time to equivocate.
No question. Fantastic to have you both on. Ambassador Jon Huntsman, Spider Marks, two experts on Asia on a very important, very tense time in those relations. Coming up ahead, as the NFL gears up for big holiday games, are fans concerned about a major controversy hanging over pro football?